In the past 18 months, there have been several massive revolts in China. That's rare for a dictatorial regime. It began with Evergrand came first, then Hanan, only for over 100 people to be burned alive in their homes due to an accident. Are the Chinese now standing up against the CCP's dictatorship? Does this break the unspoken pact of the Tiananmen Square massacre between the government and the people? Join us as we discuss the recent wave of protests in China and what it implies for the CCP's future in this video. The bank protests in Hanan were against the 4 banks that had defrauded their clients of billions. Then, this escalated into a nationwide mortgage protest against banks and developers. The CCP had to bring in undercover officers to arrest the protesters since things had gotten out of control. Just after that, Xi Jinping was the target of protests on bridges just before he was about to be elected to an unprecedented third term. There was even a sizable protest at Apple's Foxconn site, where there was a confrontation between the demonstrators and police. But as the year came to a close, there were waves of demonstrations against the CCP's zero-COVID policy throughout China. The general populace explicitly demanded that Xi Jinping resign during these rallies. That's a significant number of protesters, especially for China. It is uncommon for protests to occur in China, so the fact that there are so many in one year is absolutely strange. It all began with Evergrand. Evergrand, one of China's largest real estate developers, struggled with its financial crisis. Economic hardships have forced people onto the streets, so hundreds of rallies against frozen bank deposits descended into violence. Homeowners who have threatened to cease making mortgage payments until builders end delays in building and turn over the properties they purchased go on strike to overthrow the dictator. The majority of these demonstrations were launched for various causes, but they all shared the same characteristic. Evergrand was in financial trouble when the protest began, and Chinese citizens had given the corporation their whole life savings for apartments that were still under construction. Many began to demonstrate in order to reclaim their apartments or receive their money back. Yet, shortly after this, a brand new report surfaced that shocked the Chinese financial system. Hanan's regional banks had embezzled billions of dollars in consumer deposits. Many people had invested their whole life savings in the high interest rate programs that banks offered. But because regulators provided little control, bank employees had access to these funds and fled with them. The final group of protests, the mortgage protests, are actually brought on by this. Because China's whole real estate sector was over-leveraged, many other Chinese developers began to exhibit bankruptcy-related symptoms after the Evergrand news. Several residents were still required to make mortgage payments to the banks, even though they had a general understanding at this point that they would not be getting their units. The people responded, "Not going to happen." They began to protest the banks and stopped making their mortgage payments. This was a serious crisis for China's banking industry because if there had been any chance of a national bank failure, the country's entire economy would have fallen apart quickly. But the people were also getting sick of Xi Jinping's zero-COVID restrictions. Several individuals put up posters on a bridge just 2 days prior to the CCP's 20th National Congress, where Xi Jinping was elected to a third term. The posters read, "We want food to eat, not nucleic acid testing. Lockdowns are not what we want. Freedom is. We want dignity. We don't want lies. Reform, not a cultural revolution, is what we seek. Elections are what we want. We don't want autocratic leaders. We prefer to be citizens rather than slaves." The loudspeakers were broadcasting a similar message repeatedly. "I need food. I desire freedom. I'm going to vote. Strike both at work and school. Take out the tyrant, Xi Jinping." Although the perpetrator of these posters was never publicly identified by the police, he or she was promptly given the moniker Bridgeman, a play on the Tank Man from the Tiananmen Square riots. As the 20th National Congress drew near, the CCP had to step up security as this message spread like wildfire across Chinese social media. The Bridgeman protest photographs were destroyed by these censors, but the government was still in trouble. But the final straw that broke the camel's back was the fire in Urumqi. Citizens from all around the nation protested in the streets to demand the ouster of Xi Jinping after 110 people died as a result of the CCP's irrational COVID prohibitions. They could not leave their homes, even when there was a fire. The number of tragedies is rising, and we are seeing the largest demonstrations in China since at least the 1990s. They want him to make amends for his handling of COVID-19 or oust the government by whatever means necessary. China's citizens demand that Xi Jinping resigns immediately. It was at this point the CCP was actually compelled to concede. When protests reached a critical mass, the administration acceded to several of their demands. All around the nation, the zero COVID was loosened, and life was gradually returning to normal. A few weeks ago, this seemed like an impossibly drastic change in policy, but now the restrictions are practically non-existent, and China has seen a massive increase in positive cases of COVID. So great that the government has stopped disclosing the figures to the public, though estimates reach as high as 250 million positive cases. On the other hand, the public was indignant of CCP authorities had permitted these developers to borrow such a large sum of money before even beginning building. The public was outraged by government authorities' complicity with bank officials in misusing consumer deposits in the case of the bank protests in Hanan. And the Chinese people might have just had enough. All of this demonstrates that Chinese people are no longer scared to criticize the CCP. In actuality, since the Tiananmen Square protests, the zero-COVID protests have posed the greatest challenge to the CCP's authority. We all know what happened there, but many people are unaware of the covert agreement the CCP struck with the Chinese people following the brutal massacre. In an unofficial grand bargain, Deng Xiaoping and his two hand-picked successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, agreed to provide rapid growth in living standards in exchange for the Chinese people's continued compliance with the CCP's authoritarian rule and toleration of limited personal freedoms. Both parties upheld their end of the contract for 2 decades, but now that China's GDP is faltering, could this spell the end of the CCP? The zero-COVID policies of the CCP resulted in little to no economic growth in China's economy in 2021 and 2022, while the rest of the globe began to return to normal. The World Bank predicts that China's economy would only expand by 2.7% in 2022, which is significantly less than the CCP's goal of 5% growth. Foreign investors still hesitate to invest in China, and businesses like Apple, which previously had their main production operations there, are now seeking to relocate those operations to other countries as the number of violent crimes in China continues to rise at an unprecedented rate. Economic recovery in 2023 is quite unlikely, and if the CCP is unable to fulfill its promises to the people, will this finally be the end of communism? Let us know what you think in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep your finger right on the pulse. Stay tuned.